Night of Horror, the Manson Cult, and the Tragedy on Cielo Drive. The summer of 1969 in Los Angeles was a paradoxical time, a juxtaposition of hope and fear. It was an era when dreams of peace and love often collided with the stark realities of societal unrest. But on the night of August 8th, 1969, those contradictions coalesced into a horrific tragedy in the quiet hills of Beverly Hills at a secluded mansion on Cielo Drive. The house, a Spanish-style villa, exuded elegance and serenity. It had seen its share of glamour as a favored haven for Hollywood elites. On this particular evening, it hosted Sharon Tate, a luminous actress who embodied the era's ideals of beauty and grace. She was expecting her first child in just 2 weeks. Tate was joined by her close-knit circle of friends: Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer, and Jay Sebring, a renowned hairstylist. The group spent their evening enjoying each other's company, laughing and sharing stories. For Sharon, the night held a bittersweet quality. Her husband, acclaimed director Roman Polanski, was overseas, working on a film in Europe. Though she missed him, she looked forward to his return and the upcoming birth of their child. But the tranquility of that evening was a cruel illusion, discovery of a nightmare. By the morning of August 9th, the dreamlike calm of Cielo Drive had turned into an unimaginable nightmare. The first to discover the aftermath was a housekeeper who stumbled upon the grisly scene and called the police. Officers arriving at the residence were unprepared for the horror awaiting them. The front lawn bore the first signs of violence. Near the driveway, they found the body of Stephen Parent, a young man who had been visiting the property caretaker. He was slumped in his car, fatally shot in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to flee. Inside the home, the scene was worse. Blood was everywhere, on walls, floors, and furniture. The victims, found in various parts of the house and its grounds, bore evidence of a savage, chaotic attack. Sharon Tate, still dressed in her flowing nightgown, lay on the floor of the living room with multiple stab wounds. A rope, tied around her neck, extended to the body of Jay Sebring, who had clearly tried to protect her. The walls told their own story. The word pig was smeared in blood near the entrance, a chilling message left by the killers. The brutality of the murders shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. "In all my years, I've never seen anything like this," one officer reportedly said. The police struggled to piece together what had happened and why. The 1960s, an era of extremes. To understand the events of that night, one must look at the social fabric of the 1960s. The decade was defined by radical shifts in culture and politics. The civil rights movement had challenged the foundations of systemic racism, while the Vietnam War fueled protests and dissent. At the same time, a counterculture had emerged, led by the youth of America. This was the era of Woodstock, the Summer of Love, and the burgeoning hippie movement. Many embraced a vision of a freer, more equitable society, marked by communal living, spiritual exploration, and a rejection of traditional values. But not all was idyllic. So the darker side of the counterculture was rife with drug abuse, exploitation, and fringe ideologies. Groups like the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground highlighted the growing militancy of activism, while societal fears of anarchy and chaos deepened. Los Angeles, with its mix of wealth, glamour, and hidden despair, was particularly susceptible to these extremes. It was a city where dreams were both made and broken. While Hollywood symbolized success, its underbelly revealed a growing sense of alienation and discontent. Enter Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a figure who thrived in this turbulent environment. A drifter with a criminal past, Manson was the epitome of the anti-establishment rebel, charismatic, magnetic, and deeply dangerous. To those who knew him only superficially, he was a guru, a musician, and a prophet of a new world order. But beneath this facade lay a deeply disturbed individual. Manson was obsessed with control, driven by delusions of grandeur, and fueled by an apocalyptic vision he called helter-skelter. He believed that society was on the brink of collapse, and he saw himself as the orchestrator of the chaos that would usher in a new age. Manson gathered around him a group of followers, mostly young women, who were captivated by his charisma and promises of enlightenment. Together, they formed what would later be known as the Manson Family. Living communally on the remote Spahn Ranch, they embraced a lifestyle that was equal parts utopian idealism and chilling indoctrination. By the summer of 1969, the family had begun to take darker turns. Under Manson's influence, his followers committed petty crimes and engaged in bizarre rituals. Manson spoke often of helter-skelter, framing it as a racial apocalypse he believed was imminent. To him, the murders at Cielo Drive were not random acts of violence, but deliberate steps toward his twisted vision of the future, a shock to the nation. The murders at Cielo Drive shattered the idyllic image of Hollywood and sent shockwaves across the United States. The brutality of the crimes, combined with the fame of the victims, captured headlines worldwide. What terrified the public most was the randomness of the violence. These were not targeted killings driven by personal grievances. They were acts of pure terror, executed to fulfill the apocalyptic dreams of a manipulative leader. For many, the events at Cielo Drive marked the end of the 1960s. The dream of peace and love gave way to an era of mistrust, fear, and reckoning. The birth of the Manson family, Charles Manson's troubled beginnings. The seeds of the Manson family's tragic story were sown in the tumultuous early life of its leader, Charles Manson. Born in 1934 to a teenage mother in Cincinnati, Ohio, Manson's childhood was marked by instability and neglect. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was known for her wild lifestyle, often leaving young Charles in the care of relatives or strangers. Manson's father was absent from his life, and his mother's erratic behavior, she was once imprisoned for robbery, left a deep scar on his psyche. Manson's formative years were spent bouncing between relatives and reform schools, where he experienced abuse and learned to survive through manipulation. By the time he reached adulthood, Manson was entrenched in a cycle of petty crime, imprisonment, and escape attempts. His arrests ranged from theft to assault, and he quickly became familiar with the inside of juvenile detention centers and adult prisons. But it was during his stints in prison that Manson began to refine the skills that would later make him a cult leader. He studied the Bible, psychology, and the teachings of influential leaders like Dale Carnegie, whose book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, left a lasting impression. Manson became adept at reading people, understanding their vulnerabilities, and exploiting their weaknesses. When Manson was released from prison in 1967, he was 32 years old, a man who had spent more than half his life behind bars. Emerging into the countercultural explosion of the late 1960s, he found a society ripe for manipulation, full of young people searching for meaning, purpose, and freedom from societal constraints. The formation of the family. Manson arrived in San Francisco during the height of the Summer of Love, a time when the Haight-Ashbury district was a magnet for hippies, drifters, and seekers. He quickly realized that he could use his charisma to attract followers. Manson's method was straightforward but effective. He approached young women, often those who were vulnerable due to family issues, substance abuse, or a sense of alienation. He offered them what they craved most: love, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. Manson presented himself as a guru, a spiritual guide who could show them the path to enlightenment. His message was a mix of countercultural ideals and his own warped philosophy. He spoke of communal living, free love, and rejection of societal norms, blending these ideas with apocalyptic warnings of a coming racial war. He promised his followers that they were destined to play a crucial role in the new world order that would emerge after this chaos. As Manson's group grew, they began calling themselves a family. They left San Francisco for Los Angeles, eventually settling at the Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated former movie set in the Santa Susana Mountains. The ranch became their headquarters, a place where they could live off the grid, away from the prying eyes of mainstream society. Life on the Spahn Ranch. The Spahn Ranch was both a haven and a prison for Manson's followers. To outsiders, it appeared to be an idyllic communal retreat where young people could live freely, unencumbered by societal rules. But beneath the surface, the atmosphere was one of control and fear. Manson ruled the family with an iron hand. His followers were required to abandon their previous identities, including their names and personal belongings. He preached that material possessions were chains, binding them to a corrupt society. In their place, Manson offered a new identity, one tied entirely to him and his vision. Daily life on the ranch was a mix of ritual and chaos. The group engaged in drug use, particularly LSD, which Manson used to further manipulate his followers. He would often withhold drugs from himself, remaining sober while his followers tripped, allowing him to maintain control over them. Manson also orchestrated bizarre rituals designed to reinforce his dominance. These included group sex, during which he would assert his role as the family's patriarch, and storytelling sessions where he would expound on his apocalyptic visions. His ability to weave a narrative, blending biblical prophecy, pop culture, and his own twisted ideology, kept his followers entranced. Helter Skelter, the vision of apocalypse. Central to Manson's philosophy was a concept he called Helter Skelter, a term borrowed from the Beatles' song of the same name. To Manson, the song was a prophecy of an impending racial war. He believed that Black Americans would rise up against whites, overthrowing the existing social order. However, in Manson's vision, Black Americans lacked the intelligence to govern themselves. After the chaos, they would look to him and the family to assume leadership, creating a utopian society in the aftermath. Manson convinced his followers that this apocalypse was imminent. He cited the lyrics of the Beatles as cryptic messages predicting the coming war. The White Album, in particular, became his scripture, with songs like Helter Skelter, Piggies, and Revolution, taking on profound, symbolic meanings in his deluded mind. As time passed, Manson became increasingly paranoid and desperate to see his prophecy fulfilled. He interpreted every event in the outside world as a sign that Helter Skelter was drawing near. But when it didn't happen on its own, Manson decided to take matters into his own hands, the family's descent into violence. By the summer of 1969, the Manson family had evolved from a commune of misfits into a dangerous cult. Manson began testing his followers' loyalty through increasingly violent acts. He instructed them to commit petty crimes, including theft and vandalism, to prove their devotion. The first major act of violence occurred with the murder of Gary Hinman, a musician and acquaintance of the family. Hinman had been targeted for money, but his death marked a turning point for the group. It was the first time Manson directly ordered one of his followers to kill. After Hinman's murder, Manson's rhetoric grew darker. He warned his followers that they needed to prepare for the coming apocalypse by becoming killers. He began instructing them in the use of weapons and the art of silent killing. A fatal intersection with Hollywood Manson's obsession with fame and the music industry also played a role in the events that followed. He had spent months trying to secure a recording contract, using his connections to people in the entertainment world. One of these connections was Terry Melcher, a music producer who had initially shown interest in Manson's music, but later rejected him. Melcher had once lived at 10050 Cielo Drive, the house that would later become the site of the infamous murders. Although Melcher no longer resided there, the house represented Manson's frustration with the industry and his sense of rejection. Manson decided that the time had come to send a message, a violent act that would both spark helter-skelter and announce the family's power to the world. The target would be Cielo Drive, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Preparations for murder, a paranoid leader. By the summer of 1969, life within the Manson family had reached a boiling point. What had begun as an idyllic-seeming commune of free spirits had transformed into a tightly controlled and paranoid environment. Charles Manson, once a charismatic leader promising love and enlightenment, had become increasingly erratic and volatile. Manson's obsession with his apocalyptic vision of helter-skelter intensified. He became convinced that time was running out to ignite the racial war he had prophesied. To his followers, Manson's urgency was both frightening and infectious. He warned them that their survival and the creation of a utopian society depended on their unwavering loyalty and willingness to act, testing loyalty through violence. Manson began testing the family's loyalty in ways that grew more sinister. Members were ordered to commit thefts, vandalism, and other minor crimes, which Manson framed as acts of rebellion against the corrupt system. These actions were not just about survival or protest. They were designed to prove that the family would follow Manson's orders without question. The tipping point came with the murder of Gary Hinman in late July 1969. Hinman, a musician who was friendly with the family, had been targeted by Manson for his perceived wealth. Manson believed Hinman had money hidden in his home and sent several family members, including Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Bruner, and Susan Atkins, to retrieve it. When Hinman denied having any money, the situation escalated. Manson arrived at the house with a sword, slashing Hinman's face as a warning. After Manson left, Beausoleil and the others held Hinman hostage for 2 days before ultimately killing him. Before fleeing, they scrawled the phrase "political piggy" on the wall in Hinman's blood, an attempt to frame the murder as the work of the Black Panthers. This brutal act marked the first time the family had crossed the line into murder. For Manson, it was proof that his followers would kill on his command. For the family, it was a dark initiation, binding them even more tightly to their leader. choosing the target, Cielo Drive. Manson's frustrations with the music industry and Hollywood's elite played a crucial role in selecting the target for his next act of violence. Among the many figures who had rejected Manson's musical ambitions was Terry Melcher, a prominent music producer. Melcher had once rented the house at 10050 Cielo Drive with actress Candice Bergen. Although Melcher had moved out by the time of the murders, Manson was unaware or indifferent to the change in tenants. The house represented a symbol of his rejection by the establishment, and that was enough to seal its fate. Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski had moved into the home in early 1969, unaware of its history with Manson. To the family, the identity of the new occupants was irrelevant. Manson's instructions were chillingly simple: go to that house and destroy everyone in it. A night of preparations. On August 8, 1969, Charles Manson gathered a small group of his most trusted followers at the Spahn Ranch. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian were chosen for the mission. Manson provided them with explicit instructions. They were to enter the house, kill everyone inside, and leave behind symbols designed to provoke fear and chaos. Tex Watson, a 23-year-old former high school football star, was Manson's right-hand man and the de facto leader of the group that night. Susan Atkins, a former aspiring singer, had already proven her loyalty to Manson during the Hinman murder. Patricia Krenwinkel, a shy and impressionable woman, idolized Manson and would do anything for his approval. Linda Kasabian, a newcomer to the family, had been selected because she had a valid driver's license and could act as the getaway driver. Before leaving the ranch, the group armed themselves with knives, a .22 caliber revolver, and lengths of rope. Manson emphasized the importance of leaving behind clues that would incite racial tension. He told the group to write messages in the victim's blood, similar to what they had done in the Hinman case. As they prepared to leave, Manson delivered his final instructions. His tone was calm but commanding. "Make it as gruesome as you can," he told them. Chuck. The journey to Cielo Drive. The group piled into an old Ford sedan and began their journey toward the Hollywood Hills. During the drive, Tex Watson recounted later, Manson's instructions replayed in his mind like a mantra. Linda Kasabian, who had joined the family only weeks earlier, felt a growing sense of dread. Unlike the others, she had no violent history and no intention of harming anyone, but her fear of Manson and her desire to belong to the group kept her silent. As they neared the house, Watson directed Kasabian to park at the bottom of the driveway. The group exited the car, their weapons concealed, and began the climb toward the property. Final preparations on site. Before entering the house, Watson cut the phone lines, ensuring that no one inside could call for help. It was a calculated move, underscoring the methodical nature of the attack. The house stood silent and dark, a striking contrast to the chaos that would soon erupt. Watson and the others surveyed the property, ensuring there were no immediate obstacles. The killers moved like shadows, their every step deliberate. As they prepared to carry out their mission, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kasabian later described the surreal horror of those moments, watching as her companions transformed from ordinary people into instruments of violence. Watson, wielding the revolver, took the lead. He reminded the group of Manson's orders, his voice cold and emotionless. There would be no mercy, no hesitation, unstoppable momentum. With their weapons in hand and their mission clear, the killers approached the house. Every step brought them closer to an act of violence that would shock the world and shatter countless lives. For Manson's followers, this night was the culmination of months of manipulation and indoctrination. For the victims inside, it was the beginning of an unthinkable nightmare. The tragic night at Cielo Drive. The night begins August 8th, 1969, was an ordinary summer evening in the hills of Beverly Hills. The mansion at 10050 Cielo Drive stood bathed in moonlight, surrounded by manicured lawns and quiet streets. Inside, Sharon Tate was entertaining her closest friends. Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, was enjoying a quiet conversation with her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer. Jay Sebring, Sharon's former fiancé and a celebrated hairstylist, had joined the gathering as well. For Sharon, the evening was a way to relax and find solace. She missed her husband, Roman Polanski, who was overseas, and eagerly anticipated his return. At 8 months pregnant, she was glowing with the anticipation of motherhood, her friends noting her calm, serene demeanor that night. None of them could have imagined the horror that was descending upon them. The first victim, Stephen Parent. As the group inside the house unwound, the killers approached. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian had parked their car at the bottom of the driveway, cutting the phone lines to ensure no one could call for help. The group scaled the property's fence and began their ascent to the main house. Near the property's guest house, they encountered Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the caretaker, William Garrettson. Parent, a bright and ambitious teenager, was leaving in his car after trying to sell a clock radio to Garrettson. Watson confronted Parent as he attempted to drive away. Without hesitation, Watson raised his revolver and shot Parent 4 times, killing him instantly. The sound of the gunshots shattered the stillness of the night. Parent's lifeless body slumped in his car, his murder marking the beginning of the carnage, breaking into the house. After killing Parent, the group moved toward the main house. Watson, armed with the revolver and a knife, instructed the others to follow closely. Linda Kasabian, horrified by what she had already witnessed, hung back, claiming she wanted no part in the violence. Watson forced open a window, allowing the group to enter the house undetected. Once inside, they began their methodical assault on its unsuspecting occupants. The chaos unfolds. The first to encounter the intruders was Wojciech Frykowski, who had been dozing on the living room couch. Watson struck him on the head with the revolver, stunning him and causing a deep gash that bled profusely. Frykowski, disoriented but aware of the danger, began to struggle. Watson instructed Susan Atkins to secure Frykowski while he searched for the other occupants. Atkins moved through the house, locating Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring in one bedroom and Abigail Folger in another. She forced them into the living room, where Watson and Patricia Krenwinkel joined her. The victims, confused and terrified, were herded together at gunpoint. Watson assured them that no harm would come to them if they cooperated, but his words were lies, a house of horror. As the victims begged for their lives, Watson ordered Atkins and Krenwinkel to bind their hands with rope. The assailants used the victims' own belongings, including towels and electrical cords, to restrain them. Jay Sebring, attempting to shield Sharon Tate, protested their treatment, telling Watson, "Can't you see she's pregnant?" In response, Watson shot Sebring, the bullet striking him in the chest. Sebring collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as blood pooled around him. His act of defiance had sealed his fate. Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski seized the opportunity to resist. Folger broke free of her restraints and attempted to flee, running toward the yard. Krenwinkel pursued her, tackling her to the ground. Armed with a knife, Krenwinkel stabbed Folger repeatedly, her white nightgown turning crimson. Folger pleaded for mercy, gasping, "I give up," but Krenwinkel showed no remorse. Meanwhile, Frykowski also managed to free himself and launched a desperate attack on Atkins. He grabbed her knife and struggled to wrestle it from her grip, but Watson intervened. Watson shot Frykowski twice, then stabbed him repeatedly, ensuring he would not survive. The final moments of Sharon Tate. With her friends now dead, Sharon Tate was left alone to face the killers. She was still bound, her pregnant belly heaving as she sobbed and begged for her life. "Please," she pleaded, "let me have my baby. Take me instead." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Watson and Atkins stabbed her repeatedly, their knives piercing her stomach and chest. Sharon, whose life had been filled with beauty and promise, died in anguish on the living room floor, her body surrounded by the remains of her friends. Atkins, consumed by a twisted sense of satisfaction, later recounted that she used Sharon's blood to write the word pig on the front door, a macabre nod to Manson's orders to incite racial tension and chaos. A chilling exit, the killers left the house as silently as they had entered. Linda Kasabian, who had remained outside during the attack, witnessed them emerging covered in blood. She described their demeanor as eerily calm, as though they had just completed a mundane task rather than committed a massacre. The group returned to the Spahn Ranch, where they reported their actions to Manson. He listened impassively as they described the carnage, offering neither praise nor condemnation. Instead, he told them to prepare for another mission the following night. The victims remembered. The events at Cielo Drive claimed the lives of 5 people: Sharon Tate, 26 years old, an actress beloved for her talent and warmth, and her unborn child; Jay Sebring, 35 years old, a hairstylist who revolutionized his industry and remained a loyal friend to Sharon; Abigail Folger, 25 years old, a philanthropist whose generosity and compassion defined her; Wojciech Frykowski, 32 years old, a writer and aspiring filmmaker who dreamed of a brighter future; Stephen Perron, 18 years old, a young man whose life was tragically cut short simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their lives, filled with promise and potential, were extinguished in an act of senseless brutality. The world reacts. News of the murders spread quickly, plunging Hollywood into a state of shock and fear. The sheer savagery of the crimes, combined with the fame of the victims, captivated the media and horrified the public. For weeks, speculation ran rampant. Who could have committed such an atrocity? Was it the work of a deranged individual or something more sinister? The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove even more shocking than anyone had imagined. Aftermath of the murders, the discovery of horror. The tranquility of the morning of August 9th, 1969, shattered when the housekeeper, Winifred Chapman, arrived at 10050 Cielo Drive to begin her daily routine. As she stepped out of her car, the sight of Stephen Parent's bloodied body slumped in the driveway, stopped her in her tracks. Trembling, she glanced toward the main house and noticed the front door smeared with what appeared to be blood. The word pig stood out in gruesome red against the white surface. Summoning her courage, Chapman entered the house. The scene inside was nightmarish. Blood was everywhere, on the floors, walls, and furniture. The bodies of Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski lay in grotesque poses, the violence of their final moments evident in the deep wounds that marred their once vibrant forms. Chapman fled the house, screaming as she called the police. The responding officers, hardened by years of service, were unprepared for what they encountered. One detective later described the crime scene as beyond comprehension, the sheer savagery of the murders unlike anything they had ever witnessed. The media frenzy as news of the murders broke. The media descended upon the secluded Beverly Hills neighborhood. Reporters clamored for details, and headlines quickly splashed across newspapers worldwide. The combination of the victim's fame, the shocking brutality of the crime, and the cryptic message left on the door captivated the public. Speculation ran wild. Early theories suggested the murders were drug-related or the work of a spurned lover. Others believed the killings were part of a satanic ritual, given the gruesome details and the eerie calm of the crime scene. In Hollywood, fear gripped the elite. Celebrities hired private security, fortified their homes, and changed their routines. Friends and neighbors who had once prided themselves on the openness of their circles began to distrust even those closest to them. The city's aura of glamour and possibility now carried a shadow of paranoia. The initial investigation, dead ends, and confusion. The Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, faced mounting pressure to solve the case, but the investigation was plagued by missteps and false leads. One of the first challenges was the seemingly random nature of the crime. None of the victims had clear enemies or connections to criminal activity. The word pig suggested a motive tied to countercultural movements, but the meaning remained elusive. Adding to the confusion was the discovery of another brutal murder the following night. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were found stabbed to death in their Los Feliz home, their bodies mutilated and messages scrawled in blood on the walls. At first, the police treated the two incidents as unrelated. The difference in the victims' profiles and the crime scenes led investigators to believe they were dealing with separate perpetrators. The lack of immediate progress in the investigation left the public terrified. For weeks, it seemed as though the killers had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of their identities or motives, a break in the case. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. In October 1969, a group of Manson family members was arrested at the Spahn Ranch on charges unrelated to the murders. The arrest stemmed from a series of car thefts and vandalism incidents. During their time in custody, several members began talking, their loose remarks gradually pointing investigators toward the truth. The pivotal moment came when Susan Atkins, arrested for her role in the Hinman murder, confided in her cellmate. She described in chilling detail the events of the night at Cielo Drive, boasting about her participation and expressing no remorse. The cellmate reported Atkins' confession to authorities, providing crucial information that linked the Manson family to the murders. With this lead, investigators began piecing together the connections between the family, the victims, and the ideology that had driven the killings. the arrests. In December 1969, Charles Manson and several of his followers, including Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, were formally charged with the murders. Linda Kasabian, who had acted as the getaway driver on the night of the Tate murders, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. The public was stunned by the revelations. The image of Manson, with his wild eyes and erratic behavior, became a symbol of the danger lurking within the counterculture movement. The idea that seemingly ordinary young people could be transformed into ruthless killers under the influence of a manipulative leader only heightened the sense of fear. The trial of the century. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in 1970 and quickly became one of the most infamous court cases in American history. The proceedings were a spectacle, marked by bizarre behavior from both Manson and his co-defendants. Manson carved an X into his forehead, declaring that he had removed himself from the system. His followers, ever loyal, mimicked his gesture, turning the courtroom into a theater of the absurd. At one point, Manson leapt toward the judge, shouting threats, while his followers disrupted proceedings with chants and outbursts. The prosecution, led by Vincent Bugliosi, relied heavily on the testimony of Linda Kasabian. Her detailed account of the murders painted a damning picture of Manson's control over his followers and his direct role in orchestrating the killings. Bugliosi argued that Manson had brainwashed his followers into committing the murders as part of his helter-skelter prophecy, a theory that captivated the jury. After months of testimony and deliberation, Manson and his co-defendants were convicted of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to death, though their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. The legacy of fear, the aftermath of the murders, left an indelible mark on American society. The Tate LaBianca killings shattered the idealism of the 1960s, marking the end of the counterculture movement's innocence. For Hollywood, the events of that summer represented a loss of security. The murders revealed that even the most glamorous and privileged members of society were not immune to violence. In the years that followed, the industry grappled with the trauma, producing films, books, and documentaries that sought to make sense of the senseless. For Sharon Tate's family, the pain was immeasurable. Her mother, Doris Tate, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights, dedicating her life to ensuring that Sharon and the other victims would not be forgotten. An unfinished chapter. Though Manson and his followers were behind bars, their story continued to haunt the public imagination. The trial transcripts, interviews, and media portrayals painted Manson as both a madman and a master manipulator, fueling endless fascination with his psyche and motives. The tragedy of Cielo Drive remains a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and blind devotion. The lives lost that night serve as a testament to the fragility of safety, even in the most idyllic settings. Manson as an icon of evil, a symbol of the 1960s dark side. Charles Manson's name became synonymous with evil almost overnight. To many, he was not just a criminal, but a living embodiment of the darker undercurrents of the 1960s. While the era was celebrated for its ideals of peace, love, and rebellion against conformity, Manson represented the consequences of those ideals gone awry. The long-haired, wild-eyed figure captivated and horrified the public. His persona, as portrayed during the trial, was a stark contrast to the image of the peaceful hippie. Manson's manipulative nature, coupled with his chilling lack of remorse, revealed the potential for violence hidden within the counterculture's embrace of free will and rejection of societal norms. The trial's role in creating the icon. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers played a critical role in cementing his status as a cultural symbol. The courtroom became a theater where Manson orchestrated his own dark performance. Manson often disrupted the proceedings, issuing threats and making bizarre statements. His ability to command the loyalty of his co-defendants, even as they faced the possibility of death, was a chilling testament to his influence. His female followers, including Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, mirrored his every move, their unquestioning devotion both disturbing and fascinating. The media, hungry for a sensational story, latched onto every detail. Images of Manson carving an X into his forehead, his cryptic declarations about helter-skelter, and the bizarre antics of his followers outside the courthouse made headlines around the world. Manson's image became a caricature of malevolent charisma, a man who could inspire others to commit unthinkable acts of violence without ever lifting a weapon himself. The helter-skelter philosophy. Manson's twisted interpretation of helter-skelter elevated him from a mere criminal to a figure of cultural fascination. He claimed that the Beatles' White Album contained secret messages predicting a racial apocalypse. Songs like Piggies, Revolution 9, and Helter Skelter were, in Manson's mind, coded instructions for the chaos he sought to unleash. The sheer absurdity of Manson's philosophy was part of what made it so chilling. How could anyone believe such a convoluted narrative, let alone act on it? Yet his followers did, proving the extent of his psychological control. For some, Helter Skelter became a metaphor for the societal tensions of the late 1960s. The murders, seemingly without motive, reflected the breakdown of traditional structures and the chaos of a world grappling with rapid change. Manson's vision of a race war tapped into the era's fears of social upheaval, making his ideology all the more terrifying. Manson's life in prison. Charles Manson spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he continued to cultivate his dark legacy. His notoriety made him a target for other inmates, but it also attracted a steady stream of admirers. Manson received hundreds of letters from fans who saw him as an anti-establishment hero or a misunderstood prophet. In interviews, Manson oscillated between incoherent ramblings and chilling clarity. He downplayed his role in the murders, often shifting blame to his followers or society itself. "I'm nobody," he once said. "I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine, and a straight razor if you get too close to me." Despite his imprisonment, Manson's influence persisted. He inspired other criminals, fringe groups, and even musicians who were drawn to his chaotic philosophy. Some attempted to carry out acts in his name, while others sought to understand his psyche in books and documentaries. Manson in popular culture. Manson's crimes and persona infiltrated popular culture, becoming the subject of endless fascination. Books like Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi and Kurt Gentry detailed the investigation and trial, becoming a bestseller that defined public understanding of the case. Films, television shows, and documentaries explored Manson's life and the murders from every angle. Some sought to demystify his influence, while others leaned into his status as a cultural boogeyman. Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 2019, reimagined the events at Cielo Drive, offering a cathartic fantasy where the Manson family's plans are thwarted. Manson's image also appeared in music and art, often in controversial ways. Some bands referenced him in their lyrics, while others used his likeness as a symbol of rebellion or nihilism. For example, Marilyn Manson, whose stage name was partly inspired by Charles Manson, deliberately evoked the contrast between beauty and horror in his persona. While many viewed these cultural representations as exploitative or disrespectful to the victims, others argued that they were an attempt to grapple with the enduring impact of the murders. The paradox of fascination. Why does Manson continue to captivate the public imagination? Psychologists and sociologists have long debated this question. Some attribute it to the human fascination with evil and the desire to understand what drives people to commit such heinous acts. Others point to Manson's ability to manipulate, seeing him as a case study in the dangers of unchecked charisma. For many, Manson represents a cautionary tale. His story highlights the vulnerability of individuals searching for meaning and the ease with which they can be led astray by someone who preys on their insecurities. The legacy of fear and reflection. Though Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83, his legacy lives on. His name is shorthand for cult violence and manipulation, a reminder of how easily societal ideals can be perverted. For the families of his victims, the fascination with Manson is a double-edged sword. While they have fought to keep the memory of their loved ones alive, the focus on Manson often overshadows the lives that were lost. In the end, Charles Manson's place in history is both a warning and a reflection of the fragility of human nature. He exploited the hopes and fears of a generation, turning their longing for change into instruments of destruction, reflection, and conclusion. What Charles Manson's story reveals about humanity, the story of Charles Manson and the murders on Cielo Drive, is more than a tale of senseless violence. It is a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities and complexities of human nature. Manson's ability to manipulate and control his followers shines a harsh light on the human need for connection and purpose. Many of those who joined his family were young, disillusioned, and searching for meaning in a world they felt had abandoned them. Manson's promises of love, acceptance, and spiritual enlightenment filled a void in their lives. Yet what Manson offered was an illusion. His leadership relied on psychological domination, isolation, and the exploitation of his followers' weaknesses. The transformation of ordinary individuals into cold-blooded killers under his influence underscores the power of manipulation and the dangers of blind allegiance. The Manson family's descent into violence raises unsettling questions about the capacity for evil within us all. How far can a person be pushed before they lose their sense of morality? How much responsibility lies with the manipulator versus the manipulated? These questions continue to haunt those who study the case, the impact of counterculture and ideological extremism. Manson's rise to infamy occurred during one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. The 1960s were marked by social upheaval, political unrest, and a widespread rejection of traditional norms. The counterculture movement, with its emphasis on personal freedom and communal living, provided fertile ground for charismatic leaders like Manson to exploit. While the era produced remarkable cultural and political progress, it also demonstrated the risks of ideological extremes. Manson's apocalyptic vision of helter-skelter was a grotesque distortion of countercultural ideals, turning the quest for liberation into a call for destruction. His story serves as a reminder that even the most well-intentioned movements can be co-opted by individuals with malicious intent. The murders at Cielo Drive and the broader activities of the Manson family became a turning point in American culture. They marked the end of the 1960s idealism and ushered in an era of disillusionment. The trust and openness that had defined the counterculture were replaced by fear and skepticism as society grappled with the realization that even the brightest dreams could harbor darkness. The search for justice and accountability. For the families of Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Jay Sebring, and Stephen Parent, the pain of their loss has been compounded by the ongoing fascination with Charles Manson. While the trial and convictions brought a sense of justice, the media's fixation on Manson often overshadowed the lives and legacies of his victims. Doris Tate, Sharon's mother, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights in the wake of her daughter's death. She campaigned tirelessly to ensure that the voices of victims and their families were heard in the legal system. Her efforts contributed to California's passage of groundbreaking legislation, allowing victims and their families to present impact statements during parole hearings. Doris's work ensured that Sharon's legacy would not be defined solely by her tragic death. Today, Sharon Tate is remembered not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, talented woman whose life was cut short far too soon. Lessons for the future. The story of Charles Manson and the family remains a cautionary tale for future generations. It highlights the dangers of charismatic leaders who exploit fear and vulnerability to gain control. It also serves as a warning about the seductive power of apocalyptic ideologies, which often prey on the insecurities of those searching for purpose. As society continues to evolve, the lessons of the Manson case remain relevant. Social media and other modern technologies have amplified the reach of manipulative individuals, allowing them to target vulnerable populations more effectively than ever before. The rise of online radicalization and the proliferation of conspiracy theories demonstrate that the forces that enabled Manson's rise are far from eradicated. Remembering the victims. While Manson's name looms large in the public imagination, it is vital to remember the individuals whose lives were lost. Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Jay Sebring, and Stephen Parent were not just victims of a heinous crime. They were vibrant people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones who mourn them to this day. Sharon Tate, in particular, has become a symbol of innocence and beauty, a life full of promise extinguished in its prime. Her family's dedication to preserving her memory ensures that her legacy endures as more than just a footnote in Manson's story. A final reflection. The events of August 8th and 9, 1969 remain etched in history, not just for their brutality, but for what they revealed about society. The Manson murders shattered the illusion of safety and exposed the fragility of trust in an era defined by upheaval. They remind us of the thin line between hope and despair, between love and manipulation, and between utopia and chaos. Most importantly, they serve as a testament to the enduring need for vigilance against those who seek to exploit and harm others in the pursuit of their twisted dreams. In remembering the tragedy, we honor the victims and reaffirm our commitment to a world where such atrocities are never repeated.